Time to go inside the 8 with the journos as we welcome you back to the Sunday Footy Show. From the Sydney Morning Herald, Andrew Webster. From the Australian, Brent Reid. And from the Daily Telegraph, David Riccio. Welcome, gentlemen. I don't think there's ever been a talk between NRL hierarchy and any other organisations that didn't come out as constructive and positive. From Friday, what are you finding out, how much so on those fronts?
Not much, Sterling, not much. They've kept it very in-house. Obviously, Peter V'landys, Hugh Marks and Patrick Delaney from Fox and Nine, and there was an agreement nothing had come out of that room.
Something always comes out.
To be honest, Sterling, not much has come out. It's been really locked down, really locked down. The NRL executive don't even know what happened in that meeting. That's how locked down it is. So it's just those three blokes are going to meet again early this week to talk money. They haven't got the money sorted out. That's one thing we do know, and that's the biggest issue of all. So that's about all we know.
What's the indication there that Peter V'landys doesn't have great trust in the way things have been operating in the past?
The NRL executive don't know.
No.
That's my point. Where's Peter V'landys' trust in his staff lie?
I honestly think the NRL have finally realised that the message that they've been getting out there in the last month since this whole thing sort of kicked off hasn't been that great. I think there's been that much confusion and that many... You could honestly ring 5 different people from the NRL in the last month and you get 5 different responses to what's going to happen, when we're going to restart, whether we're going to be in bubbles, all that type of stuff. And I think you could see a clear distinction this week where it was done by press release and it was kept in-house. I thought the most telling thing out of the whole thing was that Todd Greenberg, the NRL CEO, was frozen out of those talks. And you have to wonder if he wasn't a dead man walking even before coronavirus, just how long his tenure in the game continues.
So if you made that phone call, he wouldn't be one of the people that you'd be ringing, Todd Greenberg.
I'd try to ring him and see what he has to say.
So you're saying that he's
been frozen out of these negotiations because he's been left out of the main one on Friday.
Yeah. And I'm with Webby. I mean, you talk to 2 or 3 different people at the NRL and it's completely different. And the only bloke who really knows what's going on at Rugby League Central is Peter V'landys, because he's the one pulling the strings, and there's no doubt about that. He's the one in the meetings with Hugh Marks and Patrick Delaney. He's the one trying to get this thing sorted. And I don't think Peter's telling anyone about it because there's an agreement in that room that they don't talk about it with anyone, even those closest to
There's
him.
an agreement made because Peter doesn't trust the process that's been going on in
Well, maybe
the past.
the people in the room don't trust the process, though, Dave. Maybe it's not so much Peter, or maybe it's Hugh and Patrick Delaney who don't trust that things will stay in house if Peter talks to people. So, I think there's a what's the word I'm looking for?
You're a journalist.
I think I know. The 3 of them, I think, are worried that if they talk, it'll get out. There's no doubt about that.
Which makes it interesting for what Webby's talking about as far as a replacement to Todd Greenberg, if that eventuates, that he finishes up at the NRL. How much power will the next CEO have with Peter V'landys, as we've seen, such a shrewd administrator, also working for Racing New South Wales, working as the chairman for the RL Commission? Where does he? I don't see him taking over as CEO in an executive chairman role. So the next CEO... What type of CEO will that be? Is it someone that Pete V'landys can control?
We'll talk Gus into it. It'll be all right.
Do we all concede Todd's gone? I mean, do we all... that...
Well, I think it's just time. I think it's merely timing. In greater society right now, it's the worst time in the world to start paying out, a $1.2 million contract has been reported. So
I find the politics actually quite fascinating because what's the NRL going to look like when all this is over? Now, I know Peter V'landys says he doesn't want to be executive chairman. He already runs a multi-billion-dollar sport in racing and is very good at it. He's had to take control of the situation here with the coronavirus because he had to. Could you imagine if he wasn't there, if we had a Peter Beattie or a John Grant who wasn't there to take control of this? And, we can be critical of the way that Peter has been publicly, and I've been amongst them, but it's needed a really strong hand. But when that's all over, are we going to have a individual who is in tight control of not one sport but 2 sports? And when you talk about who's going to come in, then I dare say it would be someone who's a bit of piece of plasticine, who he can manipulate and he can use. So I don't think he's going to be prepared, or the commission's going to be prepared for a very strong CEO to come in to replace Todd Greenberg.
That's not a particularly strong description, is it? Someone who can
Play-Doh.
To be
fair, I think we've seen enough of Peter V'landys to indicate that wouldn't be a bad setup. To be honest, if you have a CEO that just simply focused on the commercialities of the game and driving revenue, and Peter V'landys, as we know,
to a point, To a point.
To a point,
I
that's
don't
what I
think you
said.
need a benevolent dictator running rugby league. There's too many different stakeholders. Racing's different. It's a different sport compared to rugby league. And I know that there are certain people within the game and certainly other clubs outside of Sydney that are cautious about Volandis having complete control of the game when this is all over.
All right, everything you've said and spoken about so far seems that it makes it increasingly difficult for the Warriors in regards to what they're hearing and the way that they can go about things.
Well, that's one of the issues Todd's faced, right? Because one of the Warriors' complaints this week was that they'd heard from no one from the NRL. And basically that fell back on Todd. I mean, Todd was basically charged with keeping the Warriors informed. And one of their complaints was no one had spoken to them for basically a week. And then obviously they ended up getting in touch with them, I think, on Thursday or Friday. But that's one of the issues that I think reflected poorly on Todd this week, because he's in charge of the NRL. And the assumption was the NRL would talk to the Warriors and keep them up to date with what was going on, because the Warriors were being asked to make such a huge sacrifice, but no one spoke to them until later in the week.
Granted, and they should be in communication with the Warriors, but there's not a lot to tell them.
Well, there isn't,
because
but you
we're
can still
hanging on the
talk to them.
broadcast deal.
Yeah.
We're hanging on funding. You can't send the Warriors here to Australia and say, hey, we're a chance of getting the comp up at May 28. What if it doesn't get up and running? They're stuck here. They're stuck here.
Yeah, but you've still got to keep in touch
by
with
the
them, Dave.
broadcasters.
I mean, you know, when they're coming out and saying, no, if the NRL talk to us, you've got an issue.
Yeah,
you've
no
got an
doubt.
issue. You might be able to say we had nothing to tell them, but you still ring them every day and say, hey, guys, the talks are still going on. We haven't got anything firm for
Hey
you
guys,
yet.
you
Hey, guys,
okay?
what's doing over there?
What are you doing over there?
How's it going in Auckland? But anyway, you've got to keep them
What are you
informed.
watching on
and
this?
they weren't informed.
Hey, with
all
Zoom
week.
and Skype, that's all
I
right.
think it's an indication of where we're at right now. I think there's a real go-slow on at the moment. Next week has to be huge for the game as far as decisions are made. I'm concerned that May 28 might not get up. But next week, there's critical meetings with, obviously, the broadcasters coming up. Funding models. The Warriors players aren't going to play if they don't have some finite detail in relation to how much they're going to get paid. They're not going to fly here, leave their families in New Zealand on the hope of playing on May 28.
Well, obviously, the start of the season will determine the scheduling right across the board, including State of Origin. We've heard that it may well be the final 3 games of the season after a grand final. How do you see that? If we can get a crowd, fantastic, but it's something very different.
Yeah.
I'm loving the battle between Brad Fittler and Anastasia
It's
Palaszczuk.
fantastic.
What a battle of the minds. And Freddie's winning, I've got to say.
I reckon he could be in politics longer than Mel was.
You know what? It's a really tricky one. You'd want Origin with fans in there to watch it, and Freddie's right. Like Origin, part of it is the physical presence of the crowd and the sound of the crowd, but I don't know. It's so unclear whether they're going to be able to play, whether here, Queensland or Victoria, in front of crowds before the end of the year.
Yeah, the concern for me is the amount of elite level players we'll have after a season, be it through injury, fatigue, etc. Whether we'll have the cream be available for an Origin series after we've played 13, maybe 20 rounds.
My concern is for the team that wins the grand final, they're players that were playing State of Origin, because I was drunk for 7 weeks, and I don't drink. So. Andrew West, thank you very much. Good to see you, Rudy. Thanks, David
Pete.
Riccio. Back with more on the Sunday Footy Show, the other side of this break.